Hey folks, Salam Alaikum, Samaya here. So I wanted to make a video addressing something from earlier. This topic is about white supremacy, and I was actually trying to make this video earlier, and guess what? I got harassed by a Karen. Literally. So let's try this again. Maybe I'll make a series of these videos, because there's always an endless amount of stuff to address. But anyway, this kind of spins off of a post I made earlier that I wanted to kind of expand upon, because somebody kind of irritated me, and, you know, I'm not in the mood really today, but anyway, the post said this. It was just, you can look at it, it was this morning. It said, if white people / settlers were banned from voting in the so-called U.S., the majority of this far-right BS would be gone. And then somebody responded. I've already deleted it, but I took a screenshot of it, and this person kind of has irritated me lately. I think he joined my page back in like mid-2020 during the Gilbert actions or something, but I finally blocked him because every time he jumps on any of my posts to comment, he's always doing so to argue, and he always takes a very ultra like white liberal kind of stance, at least in my opinion. So his response was, his response to what I just wrote was this: yeah, because banning a group of people from voting historically has always gone so well. I'm sorry you aren't a leftist by any means. I've seen so many problematic posts from you, it's ridiculous. Literally just a conservative, but from the other side. I don't know what the guy is talking about. I'm not a conservative and I'm not a leftist. I'm an anarchist, and he should know that. But anyway, okay, then why are you on my page? So he's not anymore. He doesn't have to see him anymore. But anyway, let's critique that. Let's critique the first part. Yeah, because banning a group of people from voting historically has always gone so well. Well, we know that. I mean, we know it's not gone so well, but he's equating two different things that are not equal, right? So let's look at the history of this country and how it got formed, right? It started with settlers, white settlers, invading Turtle Island 530 years ago. And yes, in 1776, when this country was created and voting was established, entire groups of marginalized people that were marginalized by white settlers, they weren't in and of themselves automatically marginalized. It was white people that caused their marginalization, were banned from voting, right? So black folks couldn't vote. I mean, in many states they were, forced into slavery. Indigenous people couldn't vote. A whole range of women couldn't vote, and a whole range of people couldn't vote, like if from different times, like if you didn't own property, this and that. Yeah, and it's like, but white people have never been banned from voting unless, of course, there's actually quite a bit of white people banned from voting for other reasons, like if they've been convicted of a felony and the rights haven't been restored, or if they're considered mentally incompetent, things of that nature. Of course, guess what? Those types of laws adversely impact black and brown people far more than they do white people. What I'm talking about here is not even remotely equal to what this person's talking about. So, it wasn't an accident that when I made the post, I included the term settlers in there, and I also used the phrase in the so-called U.S. rather than just the U.S. This is the reality right now, and I'm just going to say this has always been the story of America from day one. There's always been white supremacy on this land since the first settlers invaded. And the voting system, as well as capitalism, like every system that's part of the so-called United States, is intertwined with and operated by white supremacy. It doesn't matter if there are some black, brown, other people of color that are in various positions of power. The totality of the system at every level is dominated by whiteness, by white people, and by white supremacy in some way, shape, or form. And That includes this voting system. The voting system has always been rigged to where it benefits white supremacy. It's always been this way, and this is what we need to look at. Anyway, why I got pissed off at this person, I was really mad earlier, is because his statement came across to me as white fragility. Because, like he literally reacted to me literally making an argument about banning white people from voting, and I could tell that him being a white person, that was a bit of white fragility, and I don't tolerate that shit on my page. And if God forbid I'm doing it, like, please tell me. Although I assume there's plenty of people I know that would definitely tell me if that happened, but I can't stand it. Let's talk about my use of the term settlers and the phrase so-called U.S., because this is something I noticed the majority of white people, in my experience, do not understand and do not want to understand. There's an intentional blind spot, and it is intentional. It's like white people are willing to learn only to a certain extent about racism, and then they get uncomfortable, for the most part. But when it comes to things like colonialism, they're very uncomfortable. This has been at least what I've observed. And the reality is, when you look at settler colonialism and the history of this country and what has happened to indigenous peoples of these lands on Turtle Island, there's no way in hell anybody can rationally say this is a democracy. There's no way in hell anybody can say this is equal. The same applies when you look critically at the history of anti-blackness over the last, how many centuries, right? How many black people were literally violently kidnapped from their homelands, right? The homelands that they were indigenous to, forced on slave ships over to the so-called New World, and then forced into slavery, right? And are still subjected to constant racism at every level, from the police to every level of capitalism, and on and on and on. Let's look at modern day immigration, right? How all this shit talk about, Trump was trying to build the border wall all 4 years, and guess what? Biden, the Democrats, are still for the border wall. It's bullshit. And who is being constantly turned away from migrating here? Brown, indigenous people, for the most part, but also black people as well. Like black Haitians, for instance, have been turned away by Border Patrol. Mexicans are constantly turned away or being deported. People from countries all over the world that have tried to cross the so-called southern border are being turned away. I actually myself ran into some, allegedly, because I don't go around asking people their immigration status. I don't ask people their fucking papers. I don't give a fuck. But I ran into some folks who were from India trying to get into the United States. So, and guess what? They were brown. And there's been this constant thing trying to stop the brown people from coming, But yet, with the recent Ukrainian, crisis, the U.S. has allowed, I think, 200,000 Ukrainians to come into the United States. And guess who they're allowing in? White people. Almost completely all of them are white. All of this is straight up white supremacy, right? It's disgusting, and it needs to be called out and looked at and called attention to. And these are just a few examples, right? So let's talk about the voting thing, right? It probably seems extreme to a lot of people for me to make this argument. Well, why don't we just ban white people from voting? I could actually make a further argument and say, why don't we ban white people from holding any position of power at any level in the so-called U.S., right? Well, let's roll the clock back and look at the history. So in 1492, there were 0 white people on these lands. And then white people invaded, and more white people kept coming, and more and more and more. And literally what happened was a complete holistic genocide from one coast to the other coast, where white people just kept killing, stealing resources, and taking land. And it's actually still going on today. The genocide is still going on today. But, you know, the U.S. Tries to keep it in more subtle forms, you know, so that, you know, at least some conscious white people may not, you know, hopefully most, in their minds, most conscious white people, or how am I going to say this? They want the majority of white people or anybody that could potentially call it out to not notice it. You know, like there aren't healthcare disparities targeting indigenous people. Yeah. You can go down to Steele Indian School Park right here in Phoenix. There's native homeless people everywhere. I mean, isn't it sad that before white people came, there were no, like, there wasn't homelessness on Turtle Island. That was after fucking capitalism. But yet here you have indigenous people. This land is fucking theirs, and yet they don't have a home. You got indigenous people homeless in the heart of the city at Steele Indian School Park, which was what do you call it? It was one of the boarding schools or the residential schools, where we know, especially with some recent attention, particularly from so-called Canada, where they've been finding thousands of bodies of indigenous children buried under these schools, right? It's genocide. You know, food deserts. I mean, look at reservations, right? There's food deserts everywhere. What food stores and so forth are available often are like Circle K's, where there's not quality food, it's crap. All of this shit is by design. It's deliberate and it's by design. So anyway, so let's look at the whole voting thing, right? So this is what it's like, okay? It's and this is going to sound pretty violent because it is fucking violent. And I'm going to give a violent ass example. This is like you have a building, say, and somebody were to walk in the building with a gun and just shoot up the place, right? And kill basically almost everybody there except for 2 or 3 people. And those 2 or 3 people happen to be people of color. You know, basically everybody in the building is a person of color. So there's like 2 or 3 survivors, right? And then all these white people just move in, right? All these white people just pour into the building, okay? And the 2 or 3, you know, people of color that live, you know, they let them stay, right? You know, they let them stay alive anyway. And then these white people decide, we'll call these white people the founding fathers, right? Because all the founding fathers were white men. They were Christian, I think, for the most part, if not completely. You know, all these white men were the ones that decided to found this country. All of these white men were white supremacists, and many, if not most, owned slaves, right? And many, if not most, were involved to some degree, shape, or form, involved in the murder of indigenous peoples. So you have this building, all these white people move in, and then they say, hey, let's create this democracy. Everybody in this building gets a vote. Everybody gets an equal vote. So one person, one vote. And that sounds fair. Apparently, to a lot of people, it's supposedly that's a democracy. It's not. Like, think about it. Who is fucking in charge? It's not black people. It's not indigenous people. It's the white invaders that are in charge. And I believe in the 1950s in this country, I believe the percentage, if it's not 1950, it's somewhere around there, but I believe it was in the 1950s that the population in this country, white people, had the largest percentage of the overall population, and then it started to decline. And I think right now it may be in the percentage of white people in America relative to all other ethnic groups. I think it's around 60%, or it may even be 50 something. Supposedly in like 20 years, white people will become less than 50%, or like a minority, I guess you could say. You know, and a lot of white people are concerned about that, you know, unsurprisingly. So you look at now, and all these people are talking about, I notice it's mostly white people, get out the vote, get out the vote, you got to get out the vote, get out the vote. But at the end of the day, it's still voting for a white supremacist system. It's literally either blatant white supremacy, which has an R next to it, or it's white supremacy. It's like subtle white supremacy with a D next to it, but it's all white supremacy. Now, I can make this argument that why don't we have, say, indigenous people? Hold on a second. I just thought there was somebody making a lot of noise. But anyway, I can make the argument because there's been this push for like the native vote, right? I've been seeing a lot of this stuff on social media about get out the native vote. Like if you're indigenous, get out the vote. I'm not going to comment on that because I'm not indigenous, but I was going to make an argument here. What if we gave indigenous people a vote where it counted, say, 100 to 1? Where for every white person's vote, an indigenous person's vote was counted like 100 times that. Counted like 100 people. Well, I'm sure there'd be all these white people that would be outraged. Well, that's not fair. That's not fair. Why isn't it fair? Like, who was the invader that literally wiped 98, 99% of native people out? Like, how is it a democracy when you move into an area that is not yours in the first place, and you violently murder almost everybody there, and then you set up a democracy and say, well, everybody gets an equal vote, and that's democracy? No, it's not. There's no way that, like, first of all, the only reason they're a minority is because they were fucking murdered. And so, like, you can't say that giving them a vote, or even if they take advantage of the native vote and every single native person, you know, who can vote, like, you know, votes, that's not fair. It's still not fair because who's still in power? It's white people that are in power. And it's not just voting that keeps white people in power, but it's a big part of it. And so, you know, these are some of the arguments that I have. And back to my original point about, like, banning white people from voting. Well, if you understand the history of this country and how it like, there's been nothing democratic. You don't murder people and you don't murder one group of people and enslave another group of people and then create a country without their consent and say, and when you're not even from that land, and then say, oh, well, this is going to be a democracy. Like, that's such a ridiculous farce. And in 2022, it's like people still aren't getting it. And particularly white people. But, you know, there's a lot of fucking brainwashing all across the board. So, like, why basically, if white people are constantly in charge, then you still have white supremacy. And white people have been in charge of all the shit that's been going on these lands for 530 years. Not just since 1776. Slavery was going on before that. Murders of native people were going on before that. White people came with the guns and started the killing. And it's like, so we've had 530 fucking years of white supremacy. Why is it such a bad idea to say, you know what? We fucked up. Maybe it's time to hand the fucking keys over to people of color. Maybe it's time to just hand the fucking keys over and let indigenous people run shit. Let black people run shit. Let other people of color run shit. You know, such as these so-called migrants. I mean, you know, most of these migrants aren't exactly coming from, like, they're not from Europe. And there's this whole illusion like, oh, well, Mexicans aren't from here. They're not from here. Well, they're from this continent. Like, I would assume probably most have ancestry on these lands, north and like when it comes to like other like people from, say, south of Mexico on down to the tip of South America, like probably most of these people have ancestry that goes way back before 1492. And there's this whole illusion to call all these people something other. You know, they're not from here. They're from somewhere else. Actually, a lot of them, if not most of them, probably are indigenous. Like, I'm sorry, but like you look at a white person and you look at a Mexican. I'm sorry, you can tell who's from Europe and who's from this continent. So, who is the one being a settler colonizer here? It's not the people trying to come in. It's the fucking white people that are trying to keep them out, using a fake border that literally was installed for the purposes of settler colonialism. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, I feel like I've pretty much covered my points that it's like, just to me, this whole election business every 2 years, not just because of crooked politics or whatever, not just because of issues with one party or the other, literally to its core, it's a farce. Because it's like, you can't have the whole thing is based on majority wins, but historically, the majority is literally invaders, is colonizers, and that's not democratic. It's not acceptable. If you want to actually, if people are serious about wanting to pay more than lip service to, oh well, I believe in abolishing racism and and I know most of these people that say this shit are full of bullshit, because they're not really looking deeper at this stuff. That you can't, like, it's structural. It's not just somebody's biased or unbiased opinions about other groups of people. It's structural. And, you know, you can't, like, it's a joke. Like, this society, the way it functions, it's straight up white supremacy, and we need to call it what it is. And so instead of people letting their ego or their privilege get to them, maybe it makes more sense to me to be, like, humble about this and, like, and come to terms with the fact that maybe we, as in white people, shouldn't be the ones literally with any fucking power here, because it's not fair. I mean, it's been 550 years. Like, I don't want white people in power of anything here. I don't care how nice of a person you are. Like, there needs to be, like, I don't mean to use, like, the Canadian term that's often thrown around, like reconciliation, because I think, I don't know, it needs to go deeper than that, but it's like, white people need to fucking step back. Another thing that irritates me is, it's like, there's this whole thing called, getting a seat at the table, and it's the same kind of concept that I'm getting at, like, okay, black and brown people are fighting to get a seat at the table, in different ways, maybe through elections, maybe through getting appointed to some position otherwise. And it's like, oh, yay, we got this person a seat at the table and that person a seat at the table. Well, let's take a step back and look at the table. Okay, so this black or brown person got a seat at the table, but the whole fucking table is white, right? Except for that one person. Let's take a further step back, and you realize that the entire banquet hall, with all the tables in that big-ass room where you got hundreds of people, pretty much everybody in there is white. The people that are serving them food are mostly people of color, right? Let's make some historical notes of that, right? People getting served are white. The people serving are people of color. And then who are the owners of the fucking hotel that all this is taking place in? White people. Maybe instead of having all this work where people of color are having to fight for a seat at a white table, where white people still control everything, in my mindset, maybe the white people should all get up from the table and just leave, like, go out of the hotel and, like, let people of color run shit, because that actually is what's fair. It's fair. White people never legitimately came to this country. It was an invasion. So what is fair? What is actually democratic and fair is to let people of color, especially indigenous and black people, be in charge of things. You know. So, you know, one other thing I want to mention too, is something that is really old and tired, but it's very easy for white people to say, I'm not racist, I'm not racist, I'm not racist, when actually every white person is, because to assume that you have somehow unlearned to assume that 530 years of generations of white people that have been here, that, okay, from parent to child, parent to child, parent to child, like, even for me to say that I have successfully unlearned every single racist thought or behavior that's ever possible for me to engage or believe in is pretty ridiculous and arrogant. Like, white people always have shit to unlearn. So actually, and plus, white people benefit from structural racism. It's not just a personal behavior. It's not calling somebody a name or having an attitude or something like that. It's structural. White people benefit off of the backs of people of color. So that's one thing. And then another thing is, it's like, okay, white people can just say, I'm not racist and still be complicit, and focus on behavior, but not actually working on undoing anything. And I just thought of something along these lines. There was, at a recent protest at ASU against a white supremacist that was speaking there, you had a bunch of white fascists there, basically doing their security, to prevent the protesters from, barging in the building and attacking the guy, which means that they were protecting a white supremacist, even though, of course, they say, oh, we're about the First Amendment. Yeah, whatever. There was this one white guy that was a fascist that was constantly, trying to strike up conversations with protesters, and arguing and so forth, and he was always saying, I'm not racist, I'm not racist, I'm not racist. Of course, everybody kept calling him racist, racist, racist. And it's like he handled it, pretty well. Like, oh, I'm not racist. He acted like this tough-ass guy that, 30 people can call him racist, and, he just shrugs it off, blah, blah, blah. And funny enough, I took a different angle at this. I was there, and I walked up to him, and instead of me calling him a racist, I called him a colonizer. And the reason I did that was because he had brought up something where he said, he identified himself as, quote, as an American supremacist. So he says he's not a white supremacist, he's not racist, but he called himself an American supremacist. So then I responded, I said, you're a colonizer. When I called him a colonizer, here he was ignoring all these people, calling him racist, shrugging it off. But when I called him a colonizer, he instantly went into a complete rage. He was yelling, screaming, throwing his arms around. For a second there, I wondered if he was going to try to deck me in the face or something. He was completely, freaking out. And the word colonizer is what got to him, because that hit to the core of who he is. Of course he's racist, but he thinks, oh, well, he's an American supremacist, meaning, I guess in his mind, that, America first, America number one. It's all about, he says he's all for, all colors, all races, all this stuff, but, it's all about America being number one. So you take the colonialism angle and you bring attention to the fact, well, America is not legit. It was all white supremacists who came here and violently removed indigenous people and violently enslaved black people. And then it was all white supremacists who drafted the Constitution. I mean, every level of government has been set up from 1776 to now by white people. And he just lost it. And then he started turning and ignoring me and talking to the others. And I did it a second time. I called him a colonizer, and he went completely nuts again. Like literally his body was he was freaking out. He was just completely freaking out. It was crazy. But this is the kind of shit that needs to be addressed. And we need to look at this in terms of this whole voting thing, because it's it's an illusion when people call this country a democracy. It's not a democracy. It never has been. And as long as actually the America itself even exists, it's not a democracy. You can't have a democracy that's built off of violence and murder and slavery and genocide. And, you can't have that. And again, I'm an anarchist and I'm, an abolitionist. I believe in fucking abolishing all this shit. I'm sick of this whole thing where we're supposed to be all about Democrats versus Republicans. No, we need to be anti-colonial. We need to take an anti-colonial approach in addition to an anti-racist approach. We need to be for decolonization, not just for voting in the next set of white people with a handful of people of color thrown into the mix to make it supposedly look legitimate, because it's not. And by the way, even if there was an election held, and let's say the overwhelming majority of people voted in were people of color, here's the problem still. It's all still operating within the same layers. The whole system is operating within other systems of white supremacy. And every layer of this needs to be peeled off and gotten rid of. That's the bottom line. Anyway, that said, it's like if people want to exert their white fragility and flip out because of like I said, that guy, how he responded, it's like, you know, you're welcome to hit the door and leave. Like, I'm not going to engage in petty arguments. You know, I would love to see, you know, even though I'm an anarchist and I'm not for really any power structures over anybody else, you know, I believe in non-hierarchy, you know, where everybody is equal. You don't have people ruling over others. That being said, I feel it would be much better and much fairer if things were run by people of color rather than fucking white people. Right here in Phoenix. If it was up to me, I'd abolish all these city councils, all these governments, and be like, no, this is Otham land. Otham are in charge. Like, you know, to me, it's like, you know, again, it's been 530 years, and you know, if you as a white person can't seem to stomach the thought of, like, getting up from that table and walking out the door and letting people of color, particularly the most marginalized people of color, indigenous, black, you know, brown migrants, brown and black migrants, if you have a problem with, like, literally just literally take the keys, hand over the fucking keys to people that have been marginalized and still are. Hand over the fucking keys and step back. Like, if you can't do that, then you're part of the problem. You're part of the white supremacy. Anyway, that's all I really have to say right now. Y'all have a good day. Assalamu alaikum.